Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first lecture in our unit on the judicial branch. In this unit, we're going to take a look at everything from the Supreme Court to the federal court system, and we'll talk a little bit about state and local courts as well. All right, so let's get started. We're going to talk about the powers of the federal courts here in section 1 of chapter 11. And if you can see on screen, this is the actual U.S. Supreme Court building. All right, so let's first talk about the jurisdictions of our courts. So, if you guys don't know a jurisdiction, what it means, it's the authority to hear certain cases. So, if you have jurisdiction over that type of case, then you can hear that case, or jurisdiction in that area, you can rule in that area. And this goes for not just courts, but also police officers as well. So we actually have a dual court system here in terms of jurisdiction in our country. We have state courts and federal courts, and they just follow their respective laws. So states follow state laws, federal courts follow federal laws. Now, the other types of jurisdiction that we actually have specifically are concurrent jurisdiction, which is basically state courts and federal courts have that jurisdiction. They share that jurisdiction. And then you have original and appellate jurisdiction. So original is just your court of original trial. It's trial court. It's for cases that are coming up and have never been tried before. Think of your traditional cases, either civil or criminal. Most times, this original court jurisdiction is at your district or lower courts, so more local all the way up to state, but can happen at every single level. Then you have appellate jurisdiction, which is appeals jurisdiction, so like anything that has to do with an appeals court, or if a case is being appealed, that'd be appellate jurisdiction. All right, so here you can kind of see our dual court system. I would actually take a second, kind of review this. This is obviously isn't anything that you guys have to write notes on, specifically in your lecture notes, but this actually provides a lot of understanding between our federal courts and state courts and what types of cases are each try and so forth. All right, so let's first talk about federal jurisdiction, since we're talking mainly about federal courts here. Is federal jurisdiction, usually they deal with cases involving U.S. laws, so federal law, treaties with other countries, because the federal government is going to be the group that's going to be represented there. Say, like, you're going to look at a court case involving a treaty between the United States and Canada, that's federal jurisdiction. And then anything dealing with interpretations of the Constitution, that's mainly when you look at the Supreme Court, and then anything dealing with bankruptcy and maritime law. All right. Now, they have authority in certain cases. So if you have ambassadors of foreign governments, that's federal jurisdiction. Also, if there's cases in dealing with two or more governments, so there isn't a bias towards one or the other, federal government steps in. They also deal with anything with cases involving the U.S. government itself or agencies that are part of the U.S. government. It's also federal jurisdiction if you have citizen residents of other states being tried in other states as well. Just because you could, again, have a bias there between a citizen, let's say, that is from Michigan, but something happens in Ohio. That usually goes to federal jurisdiction. And then you also have it with citizens of same states, but claim land in other states for the same reason. All right, so let's talk about power and precedent. And power simply is just a reminder here, our Supreme Court, it's the most powerful court in the world. There isn't a court in the world that has more power and influence than our Supreme Court. Now, in terms of precedent, you guys need to know what precedent means. Precedent usually means that when you do something, you're setting a pattern, or at least setting a way to do something. And early on, our courts actually weren't very strong. They had to kind of work through their actions, just like our legislative branch and executive branch. They had to figure things out. So our courts actually didn't really initiate any action. It was done through people and litigants themselves or other branches of the government. So they would typically wait for the people engaged in the lawsuits to come to them, generally. And most times they really only determined federal cases, and they didn't really answer any legal questions. They left that up to the states. They were really kind of just looking at, let's answer stuff based on the Constitution itself. All right, so let's first talk about Marbury versus Madison. You guys are going to look at this a little bit in terms of some assignments like the Supreme Court WebQuest, and a couple of you may even pick it for the Supreme Court Case Project. Now, the this case, Marbury versus Madison, is important because it's the first real true instance where we have judicial power being decided and used, even though this isn't the first Supreme Court case. So let's kind of go through this. So basically, in 1801, Congress passes commissions for certain justices. So who's going to become justices of the Supreme Court? Well, in 1803, before these are completely handed out, Thomas Jefferson, our president, stops the delivery of the remaining ones. Well, William Marbury, who was slated to be or slotted to be one of these, get one of these justiceships, he files suit against the federal government. And our Chief Justice, John Marshall, actually ended up ruling in William Marbury's favor, but Thomas Jefferson actually wins under the idea that you can't forcibly deliver a position. So basically, this is actually important in two reasons. One, it actually shows that even though the Supreme Court can actually rule one way, they don't have the power to enforce it. That's important to understand as we move through and talk about the courts, and also if you guys look at cases and rulings by judges and so forth, specifically the Supreme Court, why things might not be forced through. But most importantly, and this is what I want you guys to start in your notes, is why is Marbury versus Madison important? I don't really care if you guys remember any of the details in terms of how the case got to the Supreme Court. You need to understand why it's important because of the ruling. It gives the Supreme Court the power of judicial review, okay? And that's important because judicial review is the ability of our courts, in this case the Supreme Court, and then this is going to pass down to the other federal courts, the state courts, district courts, to review laws and determine if they're constitutional or unconstitutional. Very, very important. All right. So again, here, I would actually pause this here just to review this. Marbury versus Madison. You have to know this Supreme Court case. Very, very important. All right, so let's move on and talk about John Marshall. He's our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he's very influential because our Supreme Court carves out its role and its powers because of him. And we're going to look at a couple of cases that actually helped carve out the power of the court as well as broaden the power of the federal government. So you have these four cases on screen. You have Fletcher versus Peck, which happened in 1810. It gives the power to review to state laws. So basically, this is the judicial review looking at state laws. Dartmouth versus Woodward deals with protection of corporate charters, and Dartmouth being a college looking at a corporation. They were viewing it as a corporation. That's important as business starts to develop in our country and education as well. But again, it's more carving out of powers in terms of their determining of cases. Now, that's just for the courts. In terms of actually broadening the power of the federal government in general, you have McCulloch versus Maryland and you have Gibbons versus Ogden. McCulloch versus Maryland, we're going to look at too. We've talked about previously in this class. It's important because states can't interfere in national interests. So basically, this is important because federal government has supremacy over the states. It's reaffirming the Supremacy Clause or Article 6 of our Constitution. Now, Gibbons versus Ogden, the last one here, broadens the meaning of interstate commerce. So basically giving an understanding of trade moving between the states themselves and how that actually functions. All right, just a few more. We're going to look at states' rights and the Dred Scott case. So when Marshall is done as the Supreme Court Justice, Andrew Jackson's the president, and he appoints Chief Justice Roger Taney as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, this is important because Taney's position was that he viewed that the states themselves had more power than the federal government. He was a person that followed states' rights. If you guys remember back to Chapter 4, we talked about him. It was actually a test question reviewing, what was his position. He followed the states' rights position. So the actions of the Supreme Court, as well as other actions in the government that we don't have, time to go into in this course, lead to slavery being a big issue. And the fight over slavery and the idea of who should actually have power in our country between the states or the national government is going to come to a head. So what happens is in the mid 1850s, you have the Dred Scott case. And basically what happens is Dred Scott is a slave who started off as a slave in a slave territory. His owner moves north to a free state. He ends up being sold into a military base in the north. And there's basically, long story short, basically was a slave in a slave territory. He's moved to a place where slavery doesn't exist. So he files that he should no longer be a slave because he's in a territory that doesn't have slavery. It's not legal there. So anyways, this case gets to the Supreme Court. The nation's on pins and needles. You have abolitionists who are like, he should be free. You have pro-slavery states' rights people are saying, no, he's not a person, shouldn't gain freedom. Well, Taney, being a states' rights person, he rules against Dred Scott. And this is important because in the opinion of this case, it basically states that blacks were not and could not be citizens. So therefore, you're dealing with social rights there. But also, this is important because it determines that the United States government actually has no constitutional law to stop the spread of slavery, even into territories that have it as illegal. And then this is also important in terms of territories out west as the nation's expanding. And this ultimately rules the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. And this case is important for so many reasons, just for what we've talked about, but also because it not only damages the reputation of the Supreme Court, but this is like that first real big domino to fall after the Compromise of 1850 and actions in Kansas to lead the country to the Civil War. All right, so now we're going to flip ahead and we're going to talk about some other cases and powers. So the Civil War amendments, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are important because they give rights to protect the rights of African Americans, freeing them from slavery, maintaining due process, giving them their right to vote and so forth. But there's a problem. There isn't a strong application to due process under the 14th Amendment early on because of this action of courts' positions not being necessarily enforced. And then you also have to think of racism and Jim Crow developing in the South after the Civil War. But due process is important because this idea is that you can't deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process. So without the ability to go in front of the court and have a legal ground or legal position to argue your case. Now, where this becomes important is in the slaughterhouse cases, because the slaughterhouse cases actually in effect become the first instance where there's a ruling on the 14th Amendment and this idea of due process. Now, what ends up happening is courts do end up favoring the states in these cases and argue that the 14th Amendment doesn't increase anybody's individual right and that the rights only extend to those from the federal government. Okay, and you can see there in the 14th Amendment, it says, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So it's something important to understand because the 14th Amendment is probably, outside of the first, in terms of actual individual rights and maintaining them, I would say it's probably the most important, at least arguably it is. All right, so now we're going to move on to Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson was a case in 1896 where Homer Plessy was on a train, and he viewed that he should have the right to be in the certain rail car, and that he should be able to be there. And ultimately, what ends up happening, it becomes this issue between separate rail cars, kind of idea of separate but equal. And the court upholds the Louisiana law that says there have to be separate train cars for whites and blacks. And they say it's a reasonable action. The Supreme Court said it was a reasonable action at the time to preserve peace and order. Now, the reason why this case is important because it gives legality to separate but equal and establishes that in other places across the country and gives the idea that you can have separate facilities as long as you have equal facilities. Now, we know, and you can use the political cartoon here on screen, that we know that it's not separate. It is separate, but it's definitely not equal. This is going to last until 1954. All right, now, so we're going to talk about a couple more cases here. We're almost done. with the courts and business. So the courts refused to expand individual business powers during the 1890s and early 1900s. And eventually, what you end up seeing is, even though they're not expanding individual business powers, we do see an expansion of police and state powers for the idea of protecting people from businesses. So basically, better workers' rights. Now, the Granger cases are important because they ruled that states could not regulate private property that had a public interest. So what does that mean? It means, like, for example, there you have on the screen railroads. So even though you have private railroads, so they're owned by their own private businesses, railroads are used for public interests, such as trade and moving of goods and people across the country and from different states and so forth. So what ends up happening is as the nation starts to industrialize, courts start to side with businesses because because the country's growing and there's differences and stuff going on. Now, ultimately, what will happen, I know this seems a little confusing because they're siding against them and then siding for them, is this is during the Progressive Era. And as the Progressive Era takes shape and you kind of go back and forth, ultimately, to make it less confusing, you start seeing the courts regulating businesses in this back and forth era. But ultimately, out of this, you're going to see regulations and stuff for businesses and better working rights for people. Sorry if it sounds confusing. All right. Now, lastly here, we're going to talk about protecting of civil liberties. So we have to talk about this in the scope of Chief Justice Earl Warren's leadership of the Supreme Court, because he was very instrumental in protecting liberties. And one important instance, and perhaps actually the most important instance in a Supreme Court case, is Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. And you guys all know this case. This is something that you guys all know. So I'm not going to go into all the details with it, but it's important because it outlaws segregation of public schools, which in a sense, why that's important is because it overturns the separate but equal policy that's established by Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, some other cases that were ruled upon during this era to protect civil liberties where you see extension of equal protection for voting rights. You also see this backed up by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and so forth. You see rule for fair apportionment of representation in Congress so that you actually have districts apportioned correctly. Now, this is still a problem, but at least this was a step during this period to protect liberties for people and their voting rights and representation. And then you also see cases dealing with applying due process and Bill of Rights protections to people in various instances. But those are all individual case-by-case basis that you guys can actually look into if you want. All right, guys, that's all I got for you here for Lecture 11.1. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.